welcome your next storyteller to the stage, Samuel.
The worst cases always come in on Fridays, usually at 5 o'clock, almost like clockwork. I was a first-year pediatric oncology fellow at a prestigious hospital in the East Coast, and getting ready to go home on a Friday at 4 o'clock, and you never put your coat on early because you know what's going to happen. And I put my coat on, and I was close to getting out the door, and the pager goes off, and I answer the call, and they say, it's the OB ward at the hospital across the street, and we need you to come over. And I said, you have the wrong number, I'm a pediatric oncologist. And they said, you need to come over. And I said, well, let me explain the concept of pediatric oncologist. The patient is generally alive outside of the mother, and then we fix them. And they said, you really should come over. So I walked across the street, and they took me into the radiology suite, and there was a black and white image on the screen, and they said, we need you to fix that. And I said, oh, okay, what am I looking at? Because it's not a small, bald child. And so they got a radiologist, and the radiologist said, well, there's your patient, right there, the little blobby thing. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, well, what's wrong with him? And they said, well, you see that white spot on his spine, that's not supposed to be there. And I said, oh, okay, well, can you get the patient out, and we'll do something? And they said, okay, we'll get the patient out. When would you like your patient delivered? And I said, well, probably sooner rather than later. And so they gave me my scan, and I took it back to Children's, and I showed my radiologist, and I said, we need to fix this. And she said, yeah, you do, because this child has a tumor in its spinal canal, or next to the spinal cord, and its tendrils are pressing on the spinal cord, and the child is going to be paralyzed. And I said, oh, we should fix this. So I went home, because I couldn't do it right then and there, and I called, and I said, well, what do you do about the tumor on the child when the child's not born yet, to my attending? And she said, well, I don't know, I've not done that before either, so you should spend some time over the weekend figuring it out. So I went to Google, because when you're when you're new at this, it's as good as anything on a Friday night. And it turns out that people have done this before, but it's been in Japan. So Google Translate then tells you what to do. And take child out, figure out what the tumor is, administer chemotherapy. It is essentially that. So I spent the whole weekend basically coordinating. We had to get the OB-GYNs to take the child out. We had to get the child stabilized and then transferred to our neonatal ICU. We had to get a surgeon to biopsy the tumor, would put a line in the child so you could administer chemotherapy. We had to get a pathologist willing to figure out on the spot what the tumor was. We had to get the neonatal ICU nurses willing to give chemotherapy, because that's not something you typically give. They don't keep it next to the formula and the diapers, the big batch of chemotherapy. So we spent about 48 hours with very little sleep doing this, and then Monday morning comes around. They had taken the baby out over the weekend, and I went to see him, and his legs were up by his head. He was breech, and his feet were back here, and his head was up here, and you tickled his feet, and they didn't move, and he had very little movement at all in either of his legs, and this was clearly not good. So we took him to the operating room on Monday, and the surgeon put a line in, and we took a very small biopsy, and we did bone marrow biopsy to make sure that the tumor hadn't spread. And the pathologist said, well, there's only like 3 cells here. I can't really tell what it is. I said, well, take your best guess. And she took her best guess. She said, it's probably neuroblastoma. I said, okay, we can do something. And I said, do you know what stage it is? Because the chemo is determined by the stage. She said, well, So we made up we didn't make it up, but we approximated some chemotherapy. And the parents, of course, this is their first child, and they were beside themselves. And the mom was a producer for NPR, for an NPR radio show, so I knew that I really couldn't fuck this up because Bob Edwards would be talking about it one Sunday morning. Terry Gross. Maybe Terry Gross one day. So we give the child chemotherapy, and he does okay. I mean, gets through a cycle of chemotherapy, and little baby spit up, so you can't really blame it on the meds, and it's all good. And then he comes back, and we do some more, but the legs are up here, and I mean, it's a happy thing when the tumor shrinks, right? So you get rid of the tumor, the child is still not quite right. A lot of times in pediatric oncology, you win the battle and lose the war. I was a brain tumor doctor primarily, and you would get rid of the tumor, but you get rid of a lot of what made that child the child. So, 4 cycles, about 8 months later, the tumor was gone, the legs were still up there, and I did my job. The child's tumor was better. And so I didn't see him so much because I had done my job. And about 6 months after that, I was holding a fundraiser for a charity, raise money for the pediatric oncology program, and the parents of this child came to the fundraiser, and I said, "How's Henry?" And they said, "Oh, he's here." I said, "Great, wheel him in." And they said, "Well, no. And the child, who was now 11, 12 months, he walked in. And now this was many years ago. And, for many years I'd tell people, "Oh, I'm a pediatric oncologist," and they'd look at me like I just told them my dog got run over by a truck. "Oh, I'm sorry." What people fail to realize is you have losses. Anybody who takes care of patients, anybody who takes care of people you always have losses. But you do the job for the joy that you get for a victory, maybe once in a while, but to see a child walk. And this is the time of year where I get a Christmas card. It's 10 years later, the child plays lacrosse, he rides a bike. And so when I saw the theme, I thought, tell people, it's not so bad. My dog didn't die. There is joy. The child walked, and all is good. Thank you.